the truck. Now, move. Property manager Glen Harwick grabbed the dolly from Walter Odom's hands, let it clatter onto the lobby tile, and pointed at the front door like he was directing traffic. You got 30 minutes to clear your unit, or I'm calling the police and having you removed. Trespassing. You understand me? Trespassing. Walter Odom didn't say a word. He picked the dolly up off the ground, placed it upright, and looked at Harwick with the kind of stillness that made smaller men uncomfortable. Then he turned and walked back to the elevator. Harwick had been doing this for 11 years, to hundreds of tenants, black families mostly, in a building where they made up less than a quarter of the residents but accounted for over 90% of his eviction notices. He had never once faced a consequence. But Walter Odom wasn't who Hark thought he was. And what happened in that lobby was just the beginning of his problem. Let me take you back. Not to the lobby, we'll get there, but to the morning 2 weeks before, when everything that followed was already in motion, even if no one knew it yet. Walter Odom woke up at 6:15 the way he always did. Not because of an alarm, just because his body had been running on that schedule for 32 years, ever since his first year as an investigator with the city's Housing Rights Enforcement Division. Old habits don't retire when you do, they just follow you home. He made oatmeal. Steel cut, the slow kind that takes 20 minutes and can't be rushed. His wife Celestine said it was a personality test, that a man who makes steel-cut oatmeal every morning has a particular relationship with patients. She'd said it first as a joke. After a while, it stopped being one. Celestine was already at the hospital. She was a hospitalist physician, the kind who managed the complicated cases that didn't fit neatly into a single department. She left before 5 most mornings and came home quiet, the way people do when they've spent the day holding other people's worst days inside their bodies. They lived in a brick townhouse in the east side of the city, paid off, a garden in the back that Walter kept up because it gave him something to do with his hands since he'd retired 14 months ago. He was 61 years old, had the look of a man who had sat in a lot of uncomfortable chairs across from a lot of people who didn't want to tell him the truth, and had developed, over time, a face that was nearly impossible to read. That face had served him well for 3 decades. It would serve him even better now. His daughter Simone called him at 7:30 while he was still eating. She didn't say hello. She said, "Daddy, they sent another notice." He set down his spoon. Simone was 28. She lived in the Castlemont Arms, a mid-rise apartment building on the north edge of downtown. She'd moved in 3 years ago when she started her residency at the same hospital where her mother worked. A 1-bedroom on the 4th floor, small but close to the highway and close to the hospital, and in those early residency years close is all that matters. The building was managed by a company called Harwick Property Group. The property manager on site was Glen Harwick, nephew of the company's founder, a man who had been handed a job title and a ring of master keys and very little else by way of supervision. The notice Simone received was the 4th one in 6 months. First one said she'd violated her lease by having an unauthorized occupant. She lived alone. Walter had visited for a weekend in March. Second one said her rent was late. Her bank records showed it posted on the 1st of the month. Harwick's office claimed it wasn't received until the 5th. Third one said she'd been cited for noise complaints from the unit below. The woman below Simone was a retired schoolteacher who had knocked on Simone's door twice, both times to borrow olive oil and once to give her a cutting from a philodendron plant. There had been no noise complaint. The 4th notice, the one Simone was reading to him over the phone that morning, said she had violated a community policy by displaying items on her balcony. A welcome mat, a small potted succulent, and a string of battery-powered lights she'd put up in November and never taken down. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question. "Has any of this happened to your neighbors?" There was a pause. Then Simone said, "The ones that look like us?" Yeah, it has." He asked her to send him everything, every notice, every email, every correspondence. That afternoon, he drove across town and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours. By the time he left, he had a folder, a timeline, and a feeling in his chest he recognized from 32 years of fieldwork. Pattern. He didn't tell Simone what he was going to do. He said, "I'll look into it." That was all. The next morning, he drove to the Castlemont Arms and put down a cashier's check for first and last month's rent on a vacant unit on the third floor. He gave his name as W. Odom, listed his occupation as retired, and moved in 11 days later with a rolling suitcase, a coffee maker, and a legal pad. He told no one who he was. That was the point. The building had 62 units. Over the course of the following 2 weeks, Walter introduced himself to his neighbors the way people do in apartment buildings. Briefly, in the hallway, waiting for the elevator, holding a door. He wasn't pushy about it. He didn't ask pointed questions. He just listened, the way he'd spent a career learning to listen, with his whole body still and his face giving nothing away. What he heard was a chorus. Kezia Trout, 44, a transit dispatcher on the second floor, had received 5 notices in 8 months. Late fees that shouldn't have existed. An inspection she was never notified about that resulted in a lease violation for a cracked tile she hadn't known was there. She'd raised concerns with Harwick's office. She received a voicemail 2 days later that said management was satisfied the issue had been addressed. No explanation of what the issue was or what addressing it meant. Jerome and Beverly Atkins on the 5th floor both retired. Jerome was a former city bus driver. Beverly had done 30 years as a school nurse. They'd lived in the building for 6 years, longer than any other resident. They had received 11 notices total across those years. Lease violations, noise violations, a pet violation for a 12-year-old cat they had disclosed on their original application. They had paid $300 in fines. When they asked Harwick to show them documentation of the original pet policy, he told them it was in the lease addendum. He would not produce the addendum. The pattern Harwick ran was elegant in the way that ugly things sometimes are. He generated notices. He generated late fees. He generated late fees violations that were vague enough to resist challenge but specific enough to feel official. He scheduled inspections without proper notice in violation of state housing law. He applied fees to accounts in ways that made rent appear late, even when it wasn't. And when tenants pushed back, he generated more notices, escalating the paper trail toward eviction. The building's non-black residents, Walter noted, received notices at a rate of roughly 1 for every 18 months of tenancy. His black neighbors averaged 1 every 6 weeks. He documented everything: dates, times, names, unit numbers. He requested copies of notices from 4 tenants who agreed to share them. He photographed the bulletin board in the lobby where Harwick posted community policies, noting which policies were dated and which weren't, which had been there for years and which were new. He requested his own lease addendum in writing, via email, and Harwick's office sent one that differed in 3 material ways from the one Simone had signed by a different property manager who hadn't worked at the building in 2 years. On his 14th day in the building, Walter went downstairs to the management office at 9 in the morning and told the front desk he wanted to speak to Mr. Harwick about a late fee that had appeared on his account. He did this because he wanted to see how Harwick operated face to face. Harwick came out in 10 minutes. He was 53, with the manner of a man accustomed to being the only authority in whatever room he walked into. Pressed shirt, name badge, lanyard with enough keys to fill a bucket. He looked at Walter the way Walter had seen a certain kind of person look at black men his age, briefly, assessing, categorizing, moving on. The fee was $115, applied to his account 4 days after move-in. No explanation. Walter asked politely and specifically what the fee was for. Harwick told him it was an administrative processing fee for new tenants. Walter asked where that fee was disclosed in his lease. Harwick said it was standard practice and was in the welcome packet. Walter said he didn't recall seeing it in the welcome packet and asked for documentation. Harwick said he'd have the office send something over. Nothing was sent. Walter went back the next day. Harwick wasn't there. The woman at the front desk told him the manager would follow up by end of week. Nothing came. On day 18, Walter went downstairs a third time. This time he had a printed copy of his lease, a printed copy of the Harwick Property Group's publicly listed fee schedule, and a one-page summary he'd written the night before itemizing the discrepancy. Harwick saw him come through the door, and the energy and his expression shifted, something tightening behind his eyes that Walter recognized as irritation at someone who was not leaving. What Harwick said next, he would not be able to take back. He said, "Look, I don't have time to go through every little thing with every tenant. That's not how this works. You pay the fee or you don't. You don't. It accrues. Simple." He leaned on the counter. "You people always want to turn a 2-minute conversation into a deposition. You people." Walter looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I'll be in touch." Then he turned and walked to the elevator. That phrase, he filed it the way he'd filed evidence for 30 years. Precise, documented, ready to be used. He wrote it down on his legal pad when he got upstairs, with the time and the date and the name of the front desk employee who had been standing 4 feet away when it was said. 2 days later, Walter called his former colleague, Janelle Pratt. She was now the senior investigator at the city's Fair Housing Enforcement Office. They had worked together for 8 years before he retired. She was the kind of investigator who didn't need things explained twice, and who never made a move before the evidence was airtight. He told her what he had. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How many tenants?" 12 documented, he said, "but I think it goes back further. I think it goes back years." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you get me the full paper trail by Friday?" He already had it organized. The city's Fair Housing Enforcement Office operated under a consent agreement with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which meant that any substantiated complaint of racial discrimination in rental housing triggered a mandatory federal review. It was not optional. It was not something Harwick Property Group's attorneys could slow down with jurisdictional arguments or procedural delays. Janelle requested records from the city's rental registry going back 10 years. Harwick Property Group owned 11 buildings. She assigned investigators to 3 of them simultaneously while Walter's documentation anchored the case on the Castlemont Arms. What they found was not subtle. Across all 11 buildings, black tenants received notices at a rate 4.3 times higher than white tenants. Eviction filings initiated by Harwick Property Group skewed black at a rate of 78%, in a city where black residents represented 26% of renters. Administrative fees, late fees, and undisclosed charges were applied to black tenant accounts at twice the rate and at nearly triple the dollar amount per incident. The money was significant. One building alone, over 8 years, had extracted an estimated $230,000 in fees that had no basis in any disclosed lease term, applied almost exclusively to tenants of color. It was not mismanagement. It was not inconsistency. It was a system designed to extract, designed to pressure, designed to push people out and fill their units with tenants Harwick preferred. The morning Harwick came down to the lobby and grabbed the dolly from Walter's hands, he thought he was evicting a retired nobody in Unit 304 who had made a nuisance of himself asking questions. The notice had been issued the day before. Failure to comply with building policies, specifically, a single cardboard moving box stored in the hallway outside Walter's door for 45 minutes on a Saturday morning while he brought groceries in from the car. Walter had the timestamp on his phone. 45 minutes, 1 box. When Harwick told him he had 30 minutes to clear the unit or face trespassing charges, 3 other tenants were in the lobby. Kezia Trout, waiting for the elevator. Jerome and Beverly Adkins, coming back from a walk. They watched. They said nothing, but they watched. Walter rode the elevator up alone. He went to his unit. He sat down at the kitchen table where his legal pad was, and he called Janelle. She picked up on the first ring. He told her what had just happened in the lobby. She said, "He touched the dolly. He grabbed it out of my hands and threw it on the floor." She said, "Walter, that's it." The arrest warrant came 4 days later. Glen Harwick was in the management office on a Tuesday morning, reviewing a stack of notice drafts, when 2 investigators from the Fair Housing Office walked through the front door accompanied by a detective from the city's Civil Rights Unit. Behind them, a woman Walter had never met walked in carrying a briefcase that she set down on the front desk without asking permission. She introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Dana Castillo. She said, "Mr. Harwick, we have a warrant for your arrest and a court order seizing the operational records of Harwick Property Group. I'd like you to come with us." Harwick looked at them the way people look when the world has stopped making sense according to the rules they thought it ran by. He said, "I want my lawyer." He was entitled to one. He made the call, and while he waited for his attorney to arrive, Dana Castillo's team began boxing records from the filing cabinets behind the front desk, from the office computer, from the storage room in the back where physical lease files went back 9 years. The charges were extensive: racial discrimination in housing under the Fair Housing Act, fraudulent fee collection, filing false eviction notices, interference with a tenant's right to quiet enjoyment, and, stemming directly from the lobby incident, criminal harassment under color of property authority. Harwick's attorney arrived in 40 minutes and spent another 20 being briefed on the scope of the indictment. When the attorney came out of the conference room, his face was the face of a man who has just been told the number. The lobby was quiet. Kezia Trout stood near the elevator with her arms folded. Jerome and Beverly Adkins were there. 4 other tenants, people Walter had spoken to in hallways over 3 weeks. People who had handed him their notices and said quietly, "Nobody ever does anything," were standing near the mailboxes. None of them spoke. They just watched Glen Harwick walk out of the building in handcuffs. The lobby doors closed behind him. In the federal courthouse 6 months later, the case United States via Harwick Property Group was heard before Judge Constance Okafor. The courtroom held press from 3 outlets, a cluster of housing advocacy representatives, and, in the 4th row, 11 of the 12 tenants who had provided documentation. The 12th, a young woman named Rosa, who had been evicted from a Harwick building 2 years earlier and had since moved twice, sent a written statement. It was 3 paragraphs. The last paragraph read, "I thought I did something wrong. I spent 2 years thinking it was my fault. I want whoever is reading this to know that it wasn't." Judge Okafor read it into the record. The prosecution's case rested on 3 things: the documentation Walter had collected over 21 days, the 10-year rental registry data showing the statistical pattern across all 11 buildings, and the tenants themselves. Jerome Adkins took the stand on a Wednesday. He wore his good jacket and kept his hands folded on the railing in front of him. He spoke slowly, the way people speak when they have thought carefully about which words to use. He talked about the cat, about a 12-year-old cat named Henry, who had been with his wife since before their daughter was born, who had been disclosed on their original application, whose existence had never been challenged in 6 years until Harwick issued a violation notice 3 months after a rent negotiation dispute and cited a pet policy addendum that had not existed when they signed their lease. He talked about paying the $300. He said, "We paid it because we didn't want to lose the apartment, and we knew that if we fought it, more would come. That's how it works. You pay because the cost of not paying is always made to seem higher." He paused. "We lived in that building 6 years without a single problem with our neighbors. Not one. Every notice we ever received came from that office." He pointed, not toward Harwick, but toward the floor. "From that management office. From one man who decided we didn't belong there." The courtroom was quiet. A juror in the 2nd row wrote something on her notepad and did not look up for a long time. Kezia Trout testified the next day. She brought her bank statements, 3 years of them, and walked through each instance where a fee had been applied to her account on a day she could document she'd done nothing to incur it. She'd requested explanations in writing each time. She had received 4 responses in 37 months. 2 of them said the fee was valid. None of them said why. She said, "I work a split shift. I'm on the road at 4:30 in the morning. I budget to the dollar. When $150 disappears from my account on a Tuesday with no explanation, that is a significant event in my life. I filed disputes. I called. I emailed. I went downstairs and sat in that office. And every time I got close to getting an answer, there was another notice waiting for me when I got home." She looked straight ahead. I started looking for other apartments. Because that's what you do when you've run out of ways to be heard. You leave. That's what they wanted. I know that now. They wanted me to leave. Harwick's defense argued that property management involved subjective discretion, that fees were standard industry practice, that the statistical disparity in notice rates was explainable by factors unrelated to race, and that the lobby incident was an isolated misunderstanding. Judge Okafor asked the defense attorney to clarify what factors explained a 4.3 ratio in notice rates across 11 separate buildings over 10 years. The defense attorney said the data required additional context. Judge Okafor said she was listening. He did not provide it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty. Every count. Racial housing discrimination, fraudulent fee extraction, filing false eviction notices, criminal harassment, conspiracy to interfere with federally protected housing rights. Harwick stood when the verdict was read. He gripped the defense table with both hands. He didn't say anything, but the expression on his face was a particular kind of recognition. The look of a man who had operated for 11 years in the certainty that certain rooms would never be closed to him, learning that rooms close. Judge Okafor sentenced him 3 weeks later. She spoke for 9 minutes. She said, "You did not manage these properties. You mined them. You used bureaucratic process as a weapon against people who had less power than you in every measurable way. You made their homes feel precarious. You made them doubt themselves. You made them pay for the right to stay in a place where they had every legal right to be. And you continued for more than a decade because no one was looking." She looked up. Someone looked. The sentence, 7 years federal. Full restitution to all identifiable victims. Combined total, $308,000 across the 11 buildings. Permanent injunction barring Harwick from owning, managing, or holding any ownership interest in residential rental property in any state for life. Mandatory dissolution of Harwick Property Group pending legal review of all outstanding assets. The 2 senior executives of the parent company who had received summary reports flagging the disparity in eviction rates and had responded with a memo marked reviewed, no escalation required, were separately charged with willful blindness to discriminatory practices. Both resigned before trial. Both settled under the consent agreement for substantial individual penalties and 5-year exclusions from property management. 11 buildings, hundreds of tenants, more than a decade. And the complaint that started the federal clock, a woman named Simone on a 4th floor and her father who retired and still couldn't stop paying attention. Walter moved out of Unit 304 the week after the verdict. He'd only meant to stay 3 weeks. He stayed 9 because once the investigation opened, he had to remain available. And because, if he was honest, he found he didn't want to leave until the residents he'd spoken to knew someone was still there. He packed his rolling suitcase and his coffee maker and his legal pad, which was full now, every page. Jerome Adkins helped him carry the suitcase to the elevator. At the elevator door, Jerome shook his hand and held on a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. "Thank you," Jerome said. Walter said, "You were already fighting. I just made sure someone saw it." He drove home across the city. Celestine was in the kitchen when he walked in. She looked at him over the top of her glasses the way she had for 34 years of marriage, reading his face like a chart. She said, "How'd it go?" He said, "It went." She nodded. She poured him coffee. He sat down at the table, and for the first time in 9 weeks, he had nowhere he needed to be at 6:15 in the morning. Simone called him that evening. She said the building had a new interim property manager assigned by the court. Said the management office had been quiet all day. No notices slipped under anyone's door. No fees on anyone's account. She'd run into Beverly Atkins in the laundry room, and Beverly had said it felt different in there already. Calmer. Like the air pressure had changed. Walter listened with his eyes closed. He thought about Rose's 3 paragraphs. About 2 years of a woman thinking something was her fault that was never her fault. He thought about Kezia, who had started looking for other apartments because leaving was the only power the situation seemed to allow her. She wasn't leaving now. He thought about Jerome's hands on the railing, about the word daughter, about tuition payments and eviction notices, and all the ways the system can make theft look like policy. Simone was still talking. She said, "Daddy, I keep thinking. What would have happened if you hadn't been you? If you'd just been some regular person getting those notices? What would they have done?" Walter opened his eyes. He looked at the kitchen window. Dark outside, the garden invisible in it. "The same thing they've been doing for 11 years, he said. "And you would have left, or stayed and kept paying, and nobody would have known." There was a pause. Simone said quietly, "That's what scares me." He said, "Good, it should. That's why we don't stop." He hung up, sat with the quiet of the house for a while, the coffee going cold in his hands. Outside, somewhere in the city, 11 buildings sat with new oversight orders, new inspection requirements, new independent complaint processes that couldn't be rerouted through a single man's filing cabinet. Not perfect, not enough maybe, but different than it was yesterday. And in a fourth-floor apartment on the north edge of downtown, a small potted succulent sat on a balcony next to a welcome mat and a string of battery-powered lights uncontested. Nobody had sent a notice. I keep coming back to that dolly, the image of a man grabbing it out of Walter's hands and throwing it on the lobby floor like it was garbage. Like Walter was garbage. That moment, that specific, small, ugly moment, is what broke 11 years of silence open. Not a lawsuit, not a protest, but Dolly, hitting tile, in front of witnesses. There's something in that I've been sitting with. Glen Harwick didn't fall because he made one big mistake. He fell because he made thousands of small ones, stacked so neatly over so many years that he stopped seeing them as mistakes at all. That's what impunity does to a person. It doesn't make you bolder. It makes you careless. It makes you grab a dolly out of a retired investigator's hands in a lobby with 3 witnesses and not think twice about it. Because you've done worse to people with less, and nothing ever happened. That's the kind of arithmetic that eventually stops working. What Walter did, and I think about this a lot, wasn't dramatic. He didn't show up with a badge or a press release. He showed up with a rolling suitcase and a coffee maker and a legal pad, and he paid attention. 32 years of paying attention had made him into someone who knew exactly what he was looking at when he saw it. He had the knowledge to name what was happening, the discipline to document it without tipping his hand, and the patience to build something that couldn't be dismantled by a phone call from Harwick's attorney. That combination, knowing what's right, knowing how to fight for it, and being willing to stay in the room long enough to see it through, doesn't come from nowhere. Walter didn't wake up one morning with those qualities. He built them over a career, one uncomfortable chair across from one uncomfortable person at a time. What gets me about Simone's question at the end, "What would have happened if you hadn't been you?" is that she already knew the answer. She'd been living the answer. The notices kept coming because the system assumed that the people receiving them didn't have the tools to push back, and for most people, that assumption was correct. Not because they were weak, because they were isolated and tired and the cost of fighting had been deliberately set higher than the cost of leaving. Rose's 3 paragraphs. 2 years of a woman carrying something that was never hers to carry. I think about her every time someone says these things have a way of working themselves out. They don't work themselves out. Someone has to work them out. Someone has to be willing to look, to stay, to document, to call, to testify, to sit on a stand with their bank statements and walk through every single line. Jerome did that. Kezia did that. Beverly did that. Walter made it possible for their doing to matter. The cause and the consequence here are not complicated. Harwick kept going because no one could see the whole picture. The moment one person had the skill and the integrity and the staying power to hold all 11 buildings in a single frame, it was over. Not immediately. These things take months. They take 7 hours of jury deliberation and a judge speaking for 9 minutes before she gets to the number, but they end. That's what I want to hold on to. Not that justice is guaranteed. It isn't. But that it becomes possible the moment someone decides that paying attention is a form of action, that documenting is a form of resistance. that staying in the room, even when the room is a one-bedroom on the third floor with bad lighting, is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do. Walter went home, and his oatmeal was waiting, and Celestine poured him coffee, and the garden was there. Ordinary life on the other side of 9 weeks of extraordinary work. That's how it usually ends. Not with a speech, with coffee, and the quiet knowledge that 11 buildings are different today than they were yesterday. That's enough. That has to be enough. And somehow, it is.